You are tuning in to Access Live, a show about raising awareness, what's going on in the community, and to address the issues that impact youth and their families that have serious emotional and behavioral challenges. We are located at the Brookins Building at 1776 East Washington in Urbana, Illinois, and at the downtown location at 202 West Park Street.
October 15th of the year 2014, you're listening to Access Live, a community education and engagement initiative of the Access Initiative. I'm your host, Imani Bazzell, and once again, so happy to be with you. Now I'm going to give you the call number right now, because it just so happens I'm in the studio by myself waiting for my studio guest, and my guest online isn't going to be here for a few minutes. I see my guest through the window. She's on her way. So why don't I set this up? Now, when I sent my notice out this morning for all of you who receive it, I wanted to remind us of something very important. It might have sounded silly and trite, but it said, Black folks love to read. Now, some folks might raise an eyebrow and say, well, you know that isn't true. You might see magazines at Black people's house, but very few books. And you know how poorly our kids are doing in school. See, that's why we can't fall into the trap of stereotypes. One of the most dangerous things, or I'd say two of the most dangerous things about stereotypes are, one, there appears to be a hint of truth in them. So it's very easy to fall for them because you can always point to some example that suggests it's true. But the problem with stereotypes is that they're simplistic and uncritical. And you would need those things to really validate an idea or a situation. And what they also do is they continue to make the targets of stereotypes, in this case, African American youth and adults. It describes us as being one-dimensional people. No people are one-dimensional. So when you turn on the television or you go to the movies and you continue to see us in the same old roles as the prostitutes and the drug dealers and the cooks and the gangsters or the waiters and the old massa is us house burning roles, those are simply one-dimensional caricatures of people who can actually exist, and in fact were created in the minds of white supremacists and brought to life. One of the very important dangers, though, about stereotypes is sometimes we get caught up in them ourselves, because remember, we've been born and raised in the very culture that created and perpetuates these stereotypes. So we're learning the same lessons as our white brethren and sistren and other people of color in our society. So I tell you, there's not a more pitiful thing than, I remember one time Violet, hey Violet, welcome.
Thank you.
This is Violet Harris Hill. I'll tell you more about her in a second. I remember one time seeing Maya Angelou in a news interview, and she was describing what I'm describing here. And she was talking about y'all remember the JJ character from Good Times? Yeah. Dynamite, right? I've never in my life, I'm over 50 years old, I have never in my life seen a black boy or man say that or act like that. And she went on further to say the same thing. And her point being, one of the crazy twisted things that happens is that we see inaccurate pictures of ourselves, and then we go about mimicking the mimicking of us and somehow creating some truth to it. So that's some twisted sister stuff, ain't it?
Correct. I agree completely.
So we've got to be very careful of who people tell us we are. And we have got to decide for ourselves who we really are and make that clear. There is this lovely quote, I can't remember who it's by now, but she says, speak up, even though your voice may quiver. Everyone has something important to say, and we need to take the opportunity to say it. Though we also need to remember that we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth, which means we should probably listen twice as much as we talk, as our favorite literaturist and storyteller will probably tell us in a few moments. So with that little message in mind, my point is that I grew up in a society that actually valued intelligence, that valued being on top of current events, that valued storytelling, that valued reading, that in fact said there is an important place for the life of the mind. And so this is an affirmation I say to myself regularly, because I do spend a significant amount of time by myself, and I think that's good. And so I say every morning, I have a rich interior life. Try that out. Try it out for, what do they say, 21 days? They say whatever you can do for 21 days straight, you can turn into a habit. So, point being, we are not allergic to literacy. And we're going to talk about that today. And we're also later in the show going to be talking with Dr. Mildred Pearson, who is the founding director of a conference that's going to be at Eastern Illinois University on Friday. It's about preventing bullying, but the interesting approach she takes is to use SEL. Now y'all remember this. What SEL means is social emotional learning, which we are going to tie to the importance of reading and youth literature. So with that said, we have with us this afternoon Dr. Violet Harris, who I'm so excited. I just found out one connection today. Of course, I had another. You were at Oberlin with Sam.
Correct.
Yes. And also, I didn't realize you had attended Georgia at Athens.
Correct, I did.
That
and in
is
the middle of that, Atlanta University for my
okay.
master's.
All right. And the Bazzells are from Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh,
I'm
I
sorry,
didn't know
from
that.
Athens,
Just
Georgia.
Oh, okay.
And interestingly, if I might, my daughter is now in New York, and so we talk on the phone an hour, 2 hours every day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she was looking things up while we were talking. And she told me before that she had found this Bazzell Avenue in Athens. Well, while we're talking, she's scooting around with Google Maps or whatever. And for those of y'all who don't know, my children's last name is Bazzell-Smith, for my last name and their father's last name. Did she not find the intersection of Bazzell and Smith Avenues in Athens, Georgia? Oh, we got the best kick out of that. And
wonderful.
That ended up on Facebook with probably 30 responses. So we've got that Athens connection too.
And it was a good experience.
Yes, that's wonderful. So, Dr. Violet, you are a professor of curriculum and instruction in the College of Education at the University of Illinois. And every year you make sure we know about the Youth Literature Festival. Now, how is it we get to have it every year?
Well, actually, we have it every 2 years.
Every 2 years.
And we started planning in 2007, and it was the kernel of an idea presented to me by our dean, Mary Colansis. And she wanted me to serve as her associate dean, which I did for 4 years. And one of my first responsibilities that she gave me was to create a festival that would bring literature in a different way to the community. And in order to do that, I contacted a number of my colleagues within the College of Education, in the School of Library Science, and connections I had with various individuals in the community. So it's been a very community-centered program that we've established. We've had the support of all of the spouses of the presidents of the universities and the chancellors and the provosts. They've been very, very helpful in terms of getting the kinds of support that we need from various segments of the community, especially those who are willing to fund the festival. We accept donations of any kind.
Up until day of and after, probably.
And after, because we're always in planning mode, because
Yeah.
we've selected the date for the festival in 2016. And so I wanted something that would be reminiscent of a Renaissance fair, or something that would be comparable to the Humanities Festival
Yes.
that's held in Chicago, or something that would be held would be comparable to some of the ethnic festivals that are
Well,
held
you
in
know
various
what I
cities.
watch on C-SPAN every year is the Harlem Book Festival. I love it.
And that
So
is
just that
extraordinary.
for kids, essentially.
That is extraordinary. And also,
Yes.
don't forget, in the nation's capital, one of the good things that Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush, did was
Yeah.
to start a book festival.
As a librarian, yeah.
Yes, and one of the most important things that she did was that she made it multiracial and multicultural, so that our kids could understand that writers come in all
That's
shapes,
right.
sizes, ages, colors, and write in all different kinds of genres. So we have a very good core group of current and former librarians and teachers, university people, other people within the community who are devoted to various literacy issues. And so we
I
started
remember
in
my good
2007.
friend Melody Benson Rosales.
She was
has
one of
been
our first
involved, yeah.
illustrators at the first festival, and she's always supported us with that, with school visits, and with the community day that's connected with each festival. And so we wanted to make sure, when we constructed the festival, when we planned it, that we wanted to ensure that we had writers from every racial and ethnic group. We wanted to have bilingual writers. We wanted to have every genre represented. So we wanted to have not just those who wrote folk tales or poetry, but fantasy and science fiction and historical fiction and contemporary realistic fiction. We wanted to make sure all age groups were represented, and we wanted to make sure that the arts were included as well. So some of our initial performers, we had the Bodacious String Band, we had the Black Chorus, we had Mo Betta. Unfortunately, they can't be with us this year, although we prodded them, but they're competing in band competitions every week, so we understand.
That's a loss.
Yes, it is a loss, but we have another group that stepped up to the plate, and that group is Lincoln's Challenge. Those young men and women are extraordinary.
What do they do?
They have a choir group.
Oh, I didn't know
I've heard them
that.
perform, and they have angelic voices, and their commanders at the academy do a wonderful job with them. And you might have seen them in various ways throughout the community. For example, sometimes they serve at the seniors style and salad event, and they attend several of the churches, come in, and sometimes they'll sing at those churches, so they're performing.
That's lovely.
So we wanted to, one of the key elements that we wanted to include in the festival was that we believe that everyone should participate.
Yeah.
And one of the elements that we wanted to impart within the festival was this notion that even those who are seen as marginalized or outside are valuable to us. And we want them to see themselves in the literature. And we want them to see possibilities for themselves in the literature.
What would some examples be of people we would think wouldn't be included?
We go to the Juvenile Detention Center.
Yes.
We go to Cunningham Children's Home. We send them to the alternative high school.
Lovely.
And so one of the key factors for doing that, so many of our young people are incarcerated or will be incarcerated. So many of our young people who are incarcerated are functionally illiterate.
I know it. Now
or have
say what
low-
that means.
They have the skills that allow them to do some fundamental things with
Just
reading
enough.
and writing. Just enough to skate by, but not enough to realize their full potential. We want them to know that there are books that will engage them, books that will encourage them, books that will entertain them, and books that will offer them possibilities. And in the past, the late Walter Dean Myers, when he's come to our
What
community,
a loss.
has made it is an extraordinary loss. But fortunately for us, he wrote over 150 books, and it's up to us to ensure that those books remain in print by purchasing those books. So every time we buy a pair of Nikes or Air Jordans or whatever latest gear we're buy 2 books for children in your lives in order to make up so that we
Did
will
y'all
not
hear
have
that?
to beg for these books to
Did y'all
exist.
hear that? That's something very concrete we can do for every luxury item, because we really don't need really expensive athletic shoes. We might want them, but everything we buy that we want but don't need, leave space there to buy a book, preferably a book written by a Black children's author. Make sense?
It makes wonderful sense.
Yes.
And here's why it makes sense. Because children who are in Cunningham's Children's Home, Lincoln's Academy, the local Champaign School District, the local Urbana School District, Paxton, Buckley, Loda, no matter, we're going into 6 counties. So that means from Iroquois County over to Vermilion, Champaign, Ford, and so on. Those children need books as well, and they need to see a variety of people that represent the world. The world is no longer black and white. It really never has been black and white.
Right.
But even more so than ever before, children need to have these kinds of books available to them. We go to all of the schools this year. We will work with more than 6,000 children. We're sending out 21 authors. They're going to 6 counties and visiting, making 71 school visits. That's on Thursday and Friday. And then Saturday, we have the Community Day. This is where we need to amp up our participation, is during that Community Day. You can give your child a gift that will last a lifetime by bringing them to that event and allowing them to meet some of the authors who will be there and to talk with some of the authors. Not many people have that benefit, that they can go to a bookstore or a children's only bookstore and they can regularly go to see these authors present. We're in Central Illinois, so we have to make an effort to have those writers and illustrators visit us. So we want you to bring your kids out.
I have a
for that.
picture of my kids on stage waiting right close to the table, waiting to get their picture signed by what's the brother's name? Mosley.
Walter Dean Mosley.
Walter Dean Mosley.
No, Walter Mosley.
Walter Mosley. It's a terrible picture, but I keep it and prize it anyway, just so I can remind them as adults that they got a chance to meet him. And this
And you
is
know,
the
they should
same
buy
thing.
his young adult book.
Absolutely,
That
and
book
we
is
do.
47.
Yeah.
Let me explain why it's so important. There are over 5,000 children's books published each year.
Yes.
For 2013, only 67 books were written or illustrated or had significant content about African Americans.
See, that makes me cry.
The number featuring Native Americans was only 34,
Stop.
written and illustrated by Native Americans. The number featuring and written by or illustrated by Asian Pacific Americans was only about 60-something. You can get more accurate figures on the Cooperative Children's Book Center
Yeah.
at the University of Wisconsin site. But we're looking at fewer than 3% of the children's and young adult books published in 2013, featuring African Americans, Latinos, Latinas, Native Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, and multiracial people.
We've
biracial
got to
people.
do better. Let's see who we've got on the line. Hello, caller.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, is this Dr. Pearson?
This is Dr. Pearson calling.
Wonderful to hear from you. Have you been able to hear the show so far?
I heard just about the last 2 minutes. I heard all but the last 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, Doctor, hold me a sec. Sam, is that someone waiting for us on the other line too? Oh shoot. Okay, Mildred, you know we're working with Fred Flintstone here. So Mildred, let me put you on hold because we have a caller who probably got a question for Violet. Hold on. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, Imani. This is Heidi Grove.
Hi, Heidi. How are you? You're with the Champaign School District.
Yes, it's good to talk to you.
Wonderful. What are you thinking about?
Well, I was calling in because I've heard a little bit about your focus about social emotional learning in schools, and it's something that's really near and dear to my heart personally, but professionally as well. I'm a school social worker in Champaign Schools. I have been for the past 9 years. I'm also a parent of a Unit 4 alum, and so I feel like I've been really fortunate to see both sides of how that social emotional learning is embraced by public schools on the professional side, but also on the personal side as a parent.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you, as someone who is a professional educator and parent, can you talk about the role books have played and can play in promoting positive social emotional learning?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. I feel as a parent, I use books, literature with my son from the time he was really tiny with picture books, teach life lessons, and I also do that a lot as an educator. And I know that our classroom teachers are masters and mistresses of looking for those opportunities to not only teach the academic piece of reading, writing, comprehension, and understanding, but also understanding themselves and how the world works around them. I think a lot. I think a lot to our kids at school. I'm currently I'm fortunate to be at Booker T. Washington
Yes.
and also Stratton. I say to them that the first person that really taught me how to be a school social worker was Dr. Seuss.
That's wonderful. Now let me ask you something. I'm going to ask both of you all. We're going to do a little experiment.
Okay.
Since you have an expert on children's literature and someone passionate about promoting children's literature in general and multicultural children's literature in particular, pretend you're her only audience. What's one question you would want to know from her to get even better at what you do?
Oh goodness.
That's a big one.
I would say, and this is something that I try culturally, it's just a real charge and mission of my practice as someone who is a white woman working in a predominantly African-American school, predominantly African-American neighborhood. Having often done that is what can I do to really speak out and continue to advocate for those multicultural pieces of literature for my kids in my school, but in my own personal neighborhood as well. And what are those really great resources? I feel like I have an idea, and I've had different resources that I've gathered over the years, being able to give our kids voice through literature and being able to identify with that on a much more personal level. Where do I go? What are the best places?
There are quite a few. Let me start locally. The best places to go locally are your public libraries. We are fortunate in that Champaign and Urbana both have an extraordinary staff of professional children's librarians, and they would love to provide you with assistance in helping you find multicultural literature. That's the first step. A second step would be to go online and to link into resources such as the American Library Association. And the American Library Association gives book awards. Some of them are based upon particular races or ethnicities or languages. For example, the Coretta Scott King Award is given each year by the American Library Association. And the American Library Association will list all of the winners and the honor books for the Coretta Scott King medals. Here's a great example. One of the books that won for pictures for Coretta Scott King is called Knock Knock, Dreams of My Fathers. And in that book, the young man, Davy, who wrote it, talks about the loving relationship that he had with his father and the rituals that they had each morning for waking each other up. And then he writes about suddenly his father wasn't there to play their knock-knock wake-up game. And what had happened, his father went away, and he didn't know where his father was until his mother did what so many mothers and grandmothers and sisters and wives and girlfriends do. She took some form of transportation far away from where she lived to go to a place far away from where she didn't live, and she took him to where he was in prison. The father was in prison. And the son tried to leap out of her lap to cross through the window to reach his father. And that was a significant turning point for him. I've shared that book with a number of adults, and the responses have been phenomenal because they interpret it in terms of their own lives or the lives of people that they know. For some people, it resonates in terms of they have experienced someone who's been incarcerated. For others, it represents divorce or separation or death. And so as a therapist, that is the kind of book that would fit multiple individuals within your clientele. Here's another example. Another book, an author who will be here, who has resonated very strongly with our community and who needs to be here again, is Greg Neri. Greg Neri has written a graphic novel entitled Yummy, The Life and Times of a South Side Shorty. And that graphic novel is based upon a little boy who was 11 years old in the early 1990s, who was a member of one of the Chicago gangs, street gangs. And that little boy accidentally shot and killed a 16-year-old girl. This is a true story. And he was hunted down by his gang and sought by the police. Unfortunately for him, his gang members found him first, and he was executed. And his funeral became a cautionary tale for young people in the city of Chicago. And what was so striking about his funeral, and this is detailed in the book as well, is that this 11-year-old boy was very short, and in his casket was his teddy bear. That should give us pause to think about the lives that some children lead.
And just the adultification of black children.
Yeah.
It reminds you it's not true.
But then we have other kinds of books. Another site that you could go to, for example, is the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin. And they will list bibliographies that are based upon age. So they start with preschool, early elementary, middle grades, middle school, and high school. For example, they have lists such as 50 multicultural books that every child should read, 50 bilingual books for children, 50 books about social justice issues, 50 books about family, 50 books about sports, 50 books about travel. So that's also is a wonderful source as well.
Well, how about that, Miss Heidi?
Wonderful. And, all the connections are going in my head. One of my favorite books that I just recently got is a book by Missy Copeland.
Yes, that's wonderful.
Have you read Firebird? Yeah.
Yes.
And,
Christopher Myers is the illustrator. It's an extraordinary book.
It's amazing.
You should also purchase her biography for adults to go along with that.
Yes, absolutely. And I always start, there's a letter that she's written to the reader in the back, right?
Mm-hmm.
About her experience. And so the power of literature in those moments is it's so palpable, and it's so important. And it's, I think often in the busyness of a day and the rigor of getting things in the school that you need to do, that it's so important for us to have that pause, to allow ourselves to feel those things and to talk about them as a community and as a school. And our school has committed itself this year to kind of expand service that we're doing, and each month all of our classrooms are charged with doing that community service project. And so being able to reach other people, and I think through literature being able to teach those skills also is so important, and for our older kids and for our younger kids. So yes, thank you so much for their feedback.
Well, Heidi, thank you so much. Your call was so important and right on the money in that not only are we talking about the importance of literature for reading's sake, but literature as a tool And that's what you're talking about as a social worker. How can I use it as a tool to do my job well? So kudos to you. We're going to have to take a break, but keep listening, okay, Heidi?
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, audience, we will take our next visitor who is going to talk to us about social emotional learning right after this break. Stay with us.
Access Live can be heard every Wednesday afternoon from 2 to 3 p.m. on WBCP 1580 AM in Champaign-Urbana. You can learn more about the Access Initiative by visiting their website at www.access-initiative2.org.
And we are back. You're listening to Access Live, a community education and engagement initiative of the Access Initiative, and most specifically wanting to remind you that this show, sponsored by the Access Initiative, is dedicated to the mental health and well-being of the African American community. And so how better to talk about reclaiming our mental health, our behavior health, and moving towards healing than to talk about social emotional learning and wellness, not just of children, but as adults as well, and the critical role that literature has played in telling the stories of our racial and historical trauma, as well as the stories of our triumphs. So, with that in mind, Dr. Pearson, again, Dr. Pearson is calling in from Eastern Illinois University, where she will be hosting a conference on Friday that I am happy once again to be serving as MC for. And again, last year, there was a nice little contingency of church folks from Champaign, right, Mildred?
That's correct.
That was really
That's
great
correct.
at a university conference. I just loved it, honey. They wasn't sitting in the back. They was all up in it. They was all up in it. Isn't that exciting? Yeah. So, honey, tell us, one, give us a picture of what you're after in hosting this conference every year. This is the 4th annual. And then if you could speak to really what is social emotional learning and development across the spectrum from the youngest child to the oldest adult. What are we talking about?
First of all, let me thank you, Imani, for serving as our MC for the 2nd year this year, and for inviting me to be a guest on Access Live. I'm elated to have this discussion around social emotional learning. Now, to address your question about bringing voices in our community bullying prevention project, we are a nonprofit organization whose focus is on social emotional learning. And having said that, our focus is on about healing our community and helping bridge the learning community, meaning our institutions, whether that's the institution of higher learning, of a K-12 institution, the church as an institution, but our institutions, our learning communities, with our living community. So I want to begin to at least have that conversation as our context. So that's our mission. And the conference then, as a person who, my degree is in curriculum and instruction, and our focus then is how do we weave all of the disciplines, all of the voices, bridging voices, all voices, how do we bring those voices to the table around what's best for everyone?
And the thing that I love, given I did point out that there were just some regular church folks there, was that they were fully engaged. So while this was a place that expected some academic rigor in terms of people who were there to present, you know, you had to know your stuff. It needed to be based on some kind of base best and promising practices, it was also something very accessible to everyday people who could also fully engage. So kudos for that. Now, can you take a moment and explain, give some examples of what do we mean by social emotional learning, and what would it look like in a young person, and then further as they become an adult?
Sure. So based on the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning out of Chicago, that research tank, if you will, of individuals, they define social emotional learning, we call it SEL, S-E-L, as the process through which children and adults acquire they're able to acquire certain skill sets. And those skills would be, we're able to manage our emotions, we're able to set and achieve positive goals, and we're able to feel and show empathy for others, and establish and maintain positive relationships, and thus make responsible decisions as good citizens. And so that's the definition of social emotional learning in a nutshell.
So the interesting thing there is you didn't say we can't have emotions. You didn't say we can't even be passionate. What you're saying is, can we manage those passions? Can we manage those emotions so we can communicate them in a way that they can be heard and acted upon?
That's exactly right.
Yes.
And having said that, I'm actually glad you brought that up, because Daniel Goleman's work is based on emotional intelligence.
Right.
His premise is we should talk, yes, about multiple intelligences, and those are important to the cognitive domain of how we learn. But we should also have some conversations around emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence, then, provides us the subset of social intelligence that involves the ability to monitor how we feel, monitor our emotions, and then discriminate among those feelings or those emotions that we have so that we can guide our actions, right?
You know what came to my mind, Mildred, when you were saying that? Just this old idea that you might hear from a elderly black woman. Just this idea that somebody can be so book smart. Right, you're so bookmarked, but ain't got the common sense God gave a duck. And social emotional learning is about, in many ways, common sense. It's about being able to be relational. And in fact, it's about the maturation process, maturing from someone who automatically reacts from any stimuli, like a little baby. You pinch me and I cry, pinch, immediate cry, right? And slowly as they grow and learn, they develop the ability to put more space between stimulus and response. And if they're developing in a healthy way, then they're in control of their crying. Crying's good. Emotions are good. Passion is good. We just want them showing up when we're ready to show them, not because somebody's able to push our button and have us act in ways we might regret later.
That's exactly right. Well said. Because initially it starts out as perceived emotions, right?
Yeah.
Our ability to understand, like, nonverbal cues, right? And then we moved in from perceived emotions to reasoning emotions, using those emotions to promote our thinking and our cognitive abilities or activities. And then we can then prioritize, okay, what do we want to pay attention to? What do we want to react to? How should we respond, right? To garner some attention to our reasoning emotions. And oftentimes, allow me to say this if I may, as parents, and I can only say for my nieces and nephews that I've kept, I don't have children of my own, but I will say this. Oftentimes, in many children that I've helped raise in terms of K-12 schools, but we want our students and our children to be at this place of reasoning emotion.
Yeah.
So that's why I want you to know how much I appreciate it that you brought up the developmental stages, because perhaps they're not there yet. They're not at that reasoning emotion, right? And so it happens in stages. So we perceive our emotions, then we're able to reason them out, and we're able to understand what's happening to us. Oh, I get it. You know, perhaps they didn't really mean what they said. Or perhaps I read something else that's not different.
Right,
So
based on a different level of development that the person simply hasn't reached yet.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then the last stage is that's when we can manage our emotions. And so SEL is based on those evidence-based SEL practices that promote the developmental personal competencies. And those 5 would be self-awareness, knowing your strengths and limitations, self-management, being able to stay in control and persevere. You know, okay, this is happening to me, but I'm going to sustain. I'm going to be okay. Social awareness, being able to empathize with others, see things from a different perspective other than our own. You know, maybe look from a different lens or perspective. And then those relationship skills that we often talk about, because those are the skill sets that our children and even as adults that we will need to survive on any job. You know, conflict resolution. How do we work in teams? You know, things like that. And then lastly, how do we make responsible decisions?
Yes. So Violet, back to you. When I think about writing, which I feel awful about, my self-esteem is down on the floor when it comes to the idea of writing. But we aren't here to psychoanalyze me today. But I think of 2 things when it comes to writing. One is, maybe, I'm just guessing, I'm not an author, this burning desire to tell a story and somehow turning that into something that you enjoy and you believe other people will embrace. Another way I think about approaching books in general, literature in particular, is what do I want to say? What do I want to convey? The result of which will be, if you read this book, you will understand this concept or this idea better. So we know in early childhood, there are many books that are written to teach ethics, values, sharing, teamwork, social emotional learning goals. Can you talk about that?
That's true, but that's a different kind of literature.
Exactly.
That's a literature whose purpose is intentional, and whose purpose is didactic, and because you want to engage children in some kind of instruction.
Right.
And that would be books such as counting books, alphabet books, books about concepts, books about sharing, as you said, books about manners and so forth. When many people think of literature, that's not necessarily what first comes to mind, because that's the instrumental function of literature. When you read what writers have written about why they write, and you'll find parallels among other people who engage in creative activities, those who knit, those who crochet, those who dance, those who sing, those who sculpt, those who paint, those who cook, is that there's something within them, some creative impulse that has to find expression through some medium. And for some people, that medium may be writing. And when you read what writers write about their craft, many of them will say, I write because there's something I need to know for me. Or I write because I'm writing something that pleases me, that brings me joy. I love language. I love words. And then I offer my gift.
So that first idea about I got a passion, I got something to say.
Yes.
And
that's the primary motive that you'll find among many writers.
Is there a name for that?
Personal creativity.
As a kind of literature, it's sort of under the category of personal creativity.
It's just literature.
Just literature.
It's one of the factors that causes you to write. Now,
factors
of course,
that cause you to write.
You hope that you can earn a living from your
do.
writing, but artists will do what they do: music, dance, writing, singing, whatever.
They say actors act, writers write, singers sing.
Whether they're being paid or not.
That's right.
Because it's something that they have to do. It's who they are. It's visceral. they many writers will say if they didn't have writing, what would be the reason for living for them? And you'll find that quite often. You'll find that expressed. Now, what you'll find with many writers of color, African American, Native American, Asian American, Latino, Latina, is that they also have another purpose for writing. They write to bring expression to the ideas, the joys, the beliefs, the pain, the sorrow, the hopes, the desire. In short, what writer Virginia Hamilton calls the hopescape.
The hopescape?
The hopescape rather than the landscape.
Ah.
The hopescape.
Ooh.
It's a very profound concept.
Write that down, Mildred.
And
hopescape.
Yeah, and what that means is that it encompasses all of life, and that you're trying to capture what it means to be a human being within a particular context and a particular time with particular cultural processes involved. So what does it mean to be a migrant worker whose family is now living in Kankakee? How does that compare to someone whose family members were sharecroppers in the Delta, in Alabama, or in Mississippi? Or how does that compare to a child, let's say, in the Middle East who's weaving rugs? So some writers write to tell those stories. What does it mean to be that person? And now those are important stories because they speak to, at the very core, what does it mean to be a human being?
Okay, so now help me distinguish between those two types you talked about, because it feels like this type kind of sort of falls in the middle. On the one hand, I believe it's a passion. I got to tell this story. I got to write this.
Yes.
But it also feels like it's written purposefully. It's written with intention, as you said about the other kind of writing that's about learning and lessons.
Yes.
Yeah?
It varies.
Uh-huh.
Information books, for example,
Yeah.
are intended to provide us with knowledge. But we can also acquire knowledge from poetry.
Right, so you can cross.
You can cross.
You can present information
In poetic
and
form,
cross over into
literature.
fiction,
Yes.
poetry. Yes, yes, yes.
Yes. But you can also find biographies
Yeah.
that are so well written,
Mhm.
they bring to mind a novel.
Yes.
And it depends upon the writer's ability to do so, and the writer's ability to draw the reader into the fictive world that he or she creates.
So, I can't believe how old I am, and I'm asking you this question. Is literature specifically fiction?
No,
It's not.
it didn't start off as fiction. Fiction
Yes.
is a phenomenon of around the 1600s, 1700s.
Okay.
The novel is, for example.
when we talk
around
about-
before the 1600s.
When we talk about people telling narratives and stuff,
Narratives are just stories.
that's just
Every
stories.
culture, every people
That's
has
right.
narratives.
Is that literature?
Yes, narratives are literature, but it becomes confusing when you start
Yeah.
talking about form. The major categories of literature
Okay.
are poetry, drama.
Form.
The major categories, we sometimes refer to them as genre, but the major categories are poetry, drama. Those are in the beginning, and oral
Okay.
storytelling, and then those narratives that we tell and storytelling take on other forms, and a different kind of literature emerges when more people become literate,
Yeah.
and when vernacular languages and literature becomes available in vernacular languages, so that when literature is not just written, given the context in which we live in the United States, or much of what we have
Okay, so
draws
say
from
what
Europe,
you mean by this idea of in vernacular, like
the language spoken by the people.
our personal tongue.
Yeah.
So,
So
so
it-
it's not just the Queen's English, but how
Well,
we say it in the hood.
Vernacular, no, not necessarily.
No.
So it's not a hood language. Vernacular, the vernacular language is the language of the people. Where those people are, it doesn't matter. They could be in France, they could be
Yeah.
in Nairobi. It's
Right.
just the language that's spoken by the locals.
Right,
That's vernacular.
What I meant.
That's
That-
vernacular.
So
What
somebody
you may be
who writes
referring
in
to
the language of somebody who
is
lives
writing in the
in
vernacular.
Garden Hills, which is my neighborhood.
They're writing in the
That's in
vernacular.
vernacular.
But we have to be careful about that, because you will find lots of language variation
Yeah,
in Garden Hills.
absolutely.
So you will not find one way of speaking in Garden Hills or any other community. You'll find the the variety is greater within a community than it is across communities.
They say that actually about our DNA.
Yes.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and it's true. And so what you'll find, not many writers can write well in the vernacular.
Yeah.
And so when you look at children's and young adult literature, you don't find many people who write well in the vernacular. Gary Soto does it quite well with Latino literature. Virginia Hamilton was a master of doing it for African American literature.
Let's name some Virginia Hamilton books.
Okay.
She did The People Could Fly,
which everyone should probably purchase for their library because it's one of those grand myths about slavery. And it speaks to the issue that people saw what the horror of slavery was, couldn't take it anymore, and decided to either, depending on which Igbo version or which other version you hear, they decided to either walk back to Africa or they decided to fly back to Africa. So Virginia Hamilton wrote in every single genre except for poetry. She has some magnificent biographies of Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois. She has sci-fi fantasy, the Justice Trilogy. Unfortunately, we lost her about 12 years ago. But there are some wonderful writers.
Say something about this sci-fi fantasy.
Okay, we have a wonderful person who will be here, Nnedi Okorafor, who writes sci-fi fantasy. There are not many African American writers who write sci-fi fantasy. When most of us think of it, if we know it generally, we might think of Samuel Delany, who's regarded as one of the fathers of sci-fi among black writers. Also Octavia Butler, who died. The Kindred is one of her most magnificent novels that she's written. Walter Mosley has written some sci-fi, 47, Blue Light, etc. Right. But also in terms of young adult writers and children's writers, Patricia McKissick, who's out of St. Louis, she has the Clone Codes. So far there are about 4 books that's intended for middle grades to upper elementary. It's sci-fi. It blends historical elements into sci-fi fantasy. But Nnedi Okorafor will be here. She's visiting schools on Thursday and Friday and on Saturday. And her sci-fi is rooted in her Nigerian heritage. Akata, which I happen to have brought with me to the studio, is one of those examples of sci-fi writers. Nala Hopkinson is another writer, but she primarily writes for adults. So Nnedi is a professor, but she's also a writer, and this is a description of her book, Akata Witch. Her classmate, Orlu, and his friend Chi-Chi reveal that they have magical abilities, and so does she. Sunny is a free agent, overflowing with latent power, and she has a lot of catching up to do. Soon, Sunny's taking a crash course in magical history, spells, juju, shape-changing, and dimensional travel. Her new world is a secret from her family, but it's well worth all of the exhaustion and sneaking around.
So the name of that
Akata Witch.
Akata Witch.
Nnedi Okorafor, who will be here Saturday at the I Hotel from 10 o'clock until 3 o'clock.
Okay. A-K-A-T-A Witch is the name of the book.
Yes. And so she's one of the few people writing fantasy. But let me give you another example of someone who will be there. Maggie Brown, who's the daughter of the late Oscar Brown Jr., because we want to bring in people to know the arts in a different way. She will narrate Ballet for Martha, which is about Martha Graham and the ballet that she choreographed, Simple Gifts, in the 1940s. And so Maggie Brown Jr. does jazz and blues and is an extraordinary singer and performer. And she should be here because Thursday is when they start the school visits, Thursday and Friday, and she will be here on Saturday. Make sure you get there because her performance starts at 10 o'clock, I believe, and she's going to.
And where will she be?
The I Hotel. All of this will occur at the I Hotel.
I Hotel, and tell me her name again.
Maggie Brown.
Maggie Brown. Y'all, I hope y'all are writing this down.
So our 21 authors will be at the I Hotel from 9 o'clock until 3.
That is wonderful because
Lincoln's Challenge is our first performing group at 9 o'clock, so make sure you're there for them.
Lincoln's Challenge has always come like assistant at events to help with Soul Strut and stuff. So that
and Greg
is great.
Derry will be there. Here's another book. Many of us know about Josephine Baker.
That's right.
And Patricia Harubi Powell just won a Boston Boston Globe Hornbook Award for her biography of Josephine Baker. And when you see this book, it has an extraordinary blue cover. It has Josephine Baker. And you know she was known for walking with cheetahs and ocelots.
Yes.
And so there she is on the cover in a magnificent gown, her jewels.
I love it. And there's a whole other story to
with
tell
her
about
cheetah.
the Harlem Renaissance and how she ends up in Paris. Listen, y'all, we just getting started, and Sam is telling us we gotta stop. This tells us this is part one of this conversation.
True.
I love making the connection between social emotional learning and development, racial identity development, which I really want to get to with both of you all, especially you, Violet, around suggesting books for us to put together as community educators and parents that should be available based on the developmental level our children are at. We're going to develop us
but first, let's base it on
college-going
what they're
culture.
interested in reading.
Well, we do, but we got to even know what's out there. And what's out there that looks like us, no, though not exclusively us. So, on behalf of Dr. Mildred Pearson, who very much wants you to know about this fabulous conference she has Friday at Eastern Illinois University. It's about bridging voices, preventing violence, and uses a social emotional lens, something all of us must learn if we are to have good mental and behavioral health. And sure enough, if we are to be good social, emotional, and intellectual beings, we must read a lot, and we will find a way, if we do not already, to enjoy literature. And one way, as the adults who are listening, is to show up to the I Hotel on North First Street on Saturday between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. I promise you, you won't regret it. Until we talk next week, keep holding hands. Bye now.
Thank you for listening to Access Live. Access Initiative is a trauma and justice-informed system of care. We're glad that you joined us today. Please join us every Wednesday at 2 o'clock p.m. for Access Live. Thank you and be well.